Good afternoon. I'm Alex Lichtenstein from Indiana University. It really is my great privilege to be doing the question and answer session on these three papers, since for obvious reasons our three panelists are not able to be at the AHA this year. So we decided that I would then ask them questions about their papers and allow people then to follow up on that later if they would like. So let me start with a question for all three of you, which is the question of research. Just to remind the audience that you have certain constraints when it comes to doing research. You're not free to go to the archives or even access things on the internet. So I guess I wanted to get a sense from each of you about what kind of research you did and what sort of documents you found useful. You can go in any order you want.
Well, I'll go first.
Okay.
For me, primary research was relatively easy once I received a copy of the institution's annual reports. Okay. The Home for Friendless Women, Dr. Kelsey Kauffman was able to print their work had not been digitalized yet, and she was able to print a copy of their minutes of their board meeting. So once we were able to get once I was able to get the primary resources, that was relatively easy. Secondary resources, not so much. And to be quite honest with you, I relied heavily on people in the outside world to send me books that I requested on certain topics that would allow me to back up my theories.
But the annual reports were kind of the key primary source you got a hold of.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And Anna, what about you?
My topic and my area of this research to begin with was not really something we had planned on delving into in the beginning. I'm sure you find it extremely surprising to know I'm sort of the rebel of the group here and have some interesting theories. So I came up with different things that I wanted to look into. And so it was a matter of how do we find the types of things I was looking for. So once we located who the doctor was in the prison and we started doing a little more delving on him and what he was doing, primary resources became easier. But as time went on, I started making these links and connections to Parvin and other men of the time both before and after him. So then it became a matter of trying to hunt down a paper trail to make these connections on either side of him as well. And that became more difficult.
Parvin,
yes. And
Butler, and
yes.
Sharp, then.
Yes.
Which you see as kind of a interconnection.
And there's still a lot of areas I would like to research more fully involving these men and their connections, but it's difficult. We have to rely on outside people to get us what we need. It takes time on their part. It takes time to get it back to us. So, there's some difficulties.
Right. Michelle? Yeah.
I would say that the primary sources were, relatively easy to get a hold to. Once we came across the 1881 investigation, Dr. Kauffman researched newspaper articles, and that became a primary source for me. So the annual reports and media from that period of time, secondary resources, particularly Sarah Ahmed and Andrea Smith, came from a class that we took at IU. And so reading those texts in class actually informed my writing.
That was the video-linked class.
Yeah.
So I was curious about the 1881 investigation, which all of you look at, at least in part, and that does seem key. So is there a transcript on the investigation, or do you only have access to newspaper reports from that?
So there is a transcript somewhere. It's difficult to retrieve at this time. So we used primary resources from the news media articles primarily.
But if you could get a hold of the transcript,
we would love that. We would absolutely love that. So we went across several media outlets as opposed to just the Indianapolis. We went used several from Cincinnati and around so that we could be better informed, make a more informed opinion about the resources that we had.
Excellent. So another general question for all three of you. I mean, all three of you are very, very critical of and hard on the reformers. You question their motives. You paint them as self-interested, as having motives that aren't fully in sync with the values they're supposedly advancing. So I suppose talk a bit, each of you, about that, about why you question the reformers' motives so deeply, and in different ways, obviously, but. Kim, since you are the one who sees them as problem, but I think all of you are very, very critical of prison reformers in this era. So why?
I did not start out that way. And I think, Anna, you alluded to the fact that, we really didn't know what we were getting into when we first started this.
Yeah. I didn't start
and
that way either.
I made notes. I think my initial notes I don't even think I looked at the first 10 years of annual reports of the institution. I probably initially looked at the first 5 years. I was not 2 years into the review, took me 2 years to do it, but
right,
2 years, right.
Reports, yeah.
And I'm making notes. I think I ended up with 25 pages of notes, and I'm going, there's a problem here. I didn't make this up. So I didn't initially start out being critical. I was in it just to do research. What is this about? This is the founding of the institution. Who are these people? There's some very interesting conclusions that we all came to. These people are all connected in more ways than any of us could imagine. And, I would love to not be here in this prison for several reasons, and one of those is I would love to go to some of these places and do my own research because I'm fascinated by these people. But initially I was not critical of them. I feel like I reported the facts, and I'm not making this stuff up. It is what it is.
Yeah. I think a lot of us were writing the feel-good story of the year. We were going to tell the story of our benevolent reformers. That's that created this institution. That's how we approached it. So when we came across, and the archivists at the Indiana Archives brought us this article that sent us down this trail, we were like, what? It was a real shock. Oh. So that caused us, particularly myself, to delve deeper and begin to question how did Sarah Smith's motives change from this very really I want to help women attitude to I'm willing to slap them and beat them around in order to help them. There was a shift in the consciousness, and I think it had to deal with they were coming across to dealing with 127 women and girls, and they really had no real idea what they'd gotten into of managing those many people with those many backgrounds and attitudes and beliefs that weren't theirs. They weren't ready, and it shocked them a bit.
So you see, in some ways, what the female reformers do and I think your paper suggests this, as a response to what they find once they're actually trying to manage.
Oh, absolutely.
Right?
Oh,
whereas
absolutely.
Kim, I think you see their motives as something unconnected in a way to what's going on inside and being driven by economic forces on the outside, I think. But I'll get
I kept telling Dr. Kauffman, follow the money. Follow the money. This does not make sense, especially in 1873 when the country is in a depression.
Right. Deep economic crisis.
Deep depression. Yeah. And they're building these institutions. There's something wrong. Follow the money.
Okay. And Anna, what sort of brought you to being so critical? I mean, obviously, given the evidence, there's plenty to be critical of. But I suppose someone could say to you, yes, but, these guys invented the science of obstetrics. They had, they were interested in promoting female health. Aren't you being a little bit hard on them?
No.
Okay. I knew that was your answer. I'm playing devil's advocate
I
here.
think I was probably the biggest critic from the beginning and cynic on what was going on. My undergraduate study was in psychology, so I came into the project wanting to know that angle and that aspect, dealing with just mental health and health issues in general. So, I'm no historian by any means, but I did have a little history by default through my undergraduate study in psychology. So I was aware of total institutions and what was going on with the asylums. And I'm like, wait a minute, how I started asking the questions of how do we shift from asylum to prison, and then knowing in more modern times that it's right around the 1970s that they start systematically closing down state hospitals. And so what happens is we've had this displacement of mentally ill people going from asylum or hospital type settings back into prison.
Over the past 40 or 50 years.
So I'm wondering, what in the heck happened in between those two time periods? What was going on? Where were those people? Were they in the institution? Were they in the other institutions? What happened? And so it was through those questions that we find Parvin. And then, of course, we find he's right in alignment with several other men at the time, with all these crazy notions of hysteria and women's bodies themselves being pathologized, and that woman by nature of her being was sick. And so
so were you surprised when you started looking into this, were you surprised, or was there this kind of this aha moment when you discovered that Parvin was the physician at the first women's prison?
Well, yeah.
And Parvin was the one who then was, head of the AMA and advancing in a particular line along obstetrics and female health and sexuality.
Well, yeah, absolutely. It's, you just, especially in today's day and age, you can't for a minute wrap your mind around the president of the AMA deciding to be a physician at a prison.
Right.
Considering the grand scheme of things and how things go on, particularly healthcare with inmates,
so would you go so far as to say that obstetrics, gynecology, and sort of the idea of doctors specializing in male doctors specializing in female health was invented in prison, or is an artifact of what was then the prison medical complex, if you will?
I think prison became the continuum of that. I don't think it necessarily started with this. I truly think that Sims was onto something starting with slaves, and this idea of the vulnerable body that has no right, no voice, no means to say no, to separate themselves from this. So now slavery is over and done with. Where do you find those people? Or you find them in the poor immigrants, and you find them in prisoners. So I think prisons, though, have provided this foundation that has continued on. And it's provided this crop, if you will, of human bodies that are perfect for this. There's later studies that have been done, the 50s and the 60s. Alan Hornblum has a study, Acres of Skin,
right. Yeah.
Talking about some of the medical experimentation of men in that time period. Holmesburg Prison
right.
Project. We are optimal research subjects.
Ethan Blue has a
yes.
very good article about this in California,
yes.
which if you guys haven't seen, we should read, right? So I was going to ask you, so let me just follow up with you, Anna, and then I'll ask each of you specific questions. So one of the things that I noticed as I was listening, actually right when you start, you suggest that the widow that he uses as his first case study, Parvin that is, she complained,
right.
say, of sexual desire. Was she the complainant, and if so, how do we explain that? In other words, it sounds like Parvin is imposing a lot on his patients,
mm-hmm.
but sometimes do they come to him and say, help me, doctor, I'm suffering from too much sexual desire, or something like that? Is there evidence of that?
Okay, so that is a very debatable point right there.
Because he says...
Yes, on one hand,
right.
It's him saying,
right.
She says, I have an excessive
right.
desire for sexual intercourse, which may or may not be true. Right. There's theories that go back and forth on either side of this. Is it solely his word making this claim because they were pathologizing
right.
all women's bodies? Or if we look at the historical context of what was happening at that time, women truly were going to doctors for hysteria to literally have orgasm induced by a male physician because that would cure them of their hysterical...
Rachel Mains's
yes,
work, right?
Hysterical illness or whatever their problem was, that if you believe that a woman didn't have sexual desire, yet here's this woman who desires sex, well, you send her to a doctor for medical treatment. The doctor then performs induction of sexual release, if you will.
Right.
And so then you're
And that's the
cured.
cure,
You come back
right.
so many times. So you almost have these 19th century physicians who are performing a service very similar to what they were performing at the brothel.
And so here's another research question. The ruse that Parvin falls for in your final anecdote, the penis captivus
Yes.
syndrome. How do you have evidence? How do you know that was? Where's the evidence that shows that was a ruse that he fell for?
Well, I have a couple of secondary sources who
Yeah.
have talked about that particular phenomenon and how that all laid out. You do see, though, that a lot of these men in that time were backing one another with these ideas of the powerful capacity of what a woman's vagina could and could not do. So he was very much in alignment at his time with thinking of how a woman's body worked. And, he certainly was not the first person to make the connection of a vagina to a mouth and having these same type of capabilities. But then, it's interesting, and I've been racking my brain now for weeks trying to remember who exactly this was. But it was in recent times, there was actually a Supreme Court case involving a woman who claimed rape, and the male judge actually said, well, if she didn't want it, she wouldn't have allowed it to happen.
Right.
So, there is
I think
today,
this was a Missouri congressman, actually,
yeah.
right?
So, even today there's still people with this belief that lingers on that a woman's body has some sort of capability to literally prevent this from happening. And this is, several people have gone in depth on this idea of rape and what constitutes rape and what doesn't, and why rape is so difficult to argue and actually win on that claim, because there still is this residual belief that if you don't want it, you're not going to allow it to happen.
So, and I had one more question, then I'll turn to Kim. I really was struck by, you just dropped it as a little hint, and I wondered if there could be more research on this, as you suggest that the study of, the study of animal evolution and husbandry was then transferred to the study of captive populations and or women. Do you have any more?
I think,
what more you can say about that?
When we start looking deeper at what Amos Butler and his group were doing with this idea of forced sterilization and who is deemed appropriate for procreation and who is deemed unfit for procreation, it's sort of this idea of breeding people. Who should we allow to keep propagating and who do we need to cut off? There were contests that went on in Butler's era then where people were literally showing their children like livestock. There were these better baby contests.
Right.
So you'd go to the Indiana State Fair and you're showing your prize heifer and you're showing
baby.
your
But
two-year-old child.
do you have a sense of the science or the scientific knowledge such as it was? We can just keep going, because it was being transferred, or
I think
not sure?
Definitely through these ideas of biological determinism, the idea of this 5 type of human being and this idea of categorizing human beings to create this hierarchy. Right now, everybody's name is escaping me, but definitely Oscar McCullough with the Tribe of Ishmael gets his ideas from the study previous, the Jukes. They had gotten their studies. I think, we have Lombroso in there in that time period, and this idea of the phrenologists and the head
And the
shapes
criminal
and
class, right.
where criminality comes from
Right.
and how we determine that based on bodily characteristics. So, I think one thing just sort of bled into another, and each person tweaked it in their own way to evolve it to be able to fulfill their agendas.
So, Kim, let me ask you some questions. So, again, listening to the papers as opposed to reading them, I noticed things that I didn't focus on as I read them. The commitment, so you point out that actually the girls who are committed to the institution don't have to be subject to criminal conviction in a court. They are just committed, right? Do you have any sense of who commits them and how? And
Indiana Code, and I'm sorry, I don't have it in front of me, but Indiana Code basically at that time said, was very vague and alluded to, oh, they just have to be considered incorrigible. Okay, so a judge or a jury would deem a child incorrigible. Same thing Anna's talking about. Orphan, half orphan, came from a bad home. They, the idea that they would grow up to lead an idle and immoral life.
And then reproduce, potentially.
Absolutely.
Right.
Okay, so what I found interesting when I was going through the annual reports was Conrad Baker, and I believe I read that quote in the paper, Conrad Baker's letter, or if you will, to Governor Hendricks, basically telling him to let people know, well, I don't think you really understand what's going on here. We need to fill these beds. And these children don't necessarily, and they're children, which is one of the points I wanted to make. We talk about Indiana Women's Prison. Indiana Women's Prison was kept alive by these children. These were children.
Who are the majority of
yes,
the people
they were
confined
children.
here. Yeah.
When Michelle started looking at the original records, we had 3- and 4-year-old children here. So it starts out they want to fill these beds. We got to get these beds filled. Okay, so you've got the former governor writing letters to the current governor, basically telling the county commissioners, you need to send us some kids because we need to get these beds filled. Okay, so he's basically stating in this letter, I can't make this stuff up, I don't think they necessarily understand that these children don't necessarily need to commit a crime. We just need to allude to the fact that there's something wrong with them and that they can't be taken care of in the homes that they're in. We need to get this institution
So sometimes
built.
it might be due to what would be deemed today unsuitable home.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Right? Yeah.
So let's get the beds filled. So that's what they did. County commissioners sent their children.
Now, what was the advantage? And I guess this is my larger question.
Okay.
Your paper advances the idea that Smith and Kauffman profit from this, profit financially. I mean, I think all of you are suggesting that there's a sort of profit in terms of advancing one's reform agenda and one's cultural capital. But I think your paper is the one that really says that there's a financial interest here in making this institution grow.
Well, originally they were not broke by any means. The institution wasn't making money, but they weren't broke. And there's this 3-year struggle that ensues between the original board of managers, which was all male, and the females that were running basically running the institution. And there's a coup, and the women take over. And that's when you begin to see the budget cut. Okay, and I mentioned that in the paper.
Right.
So the cost of housing these children there's like a 30% drop immediately.
But is this to demonstrate in the way that I think it's Michelle's paper argues that, see, the women can run this show better? This is to demonstrate the effectiveness of the female benevolent reform touch. We are better housekeepers. We know how to manage a budget. Or is it actually, I think, as your paper does suggest, a means of generating profit for these particular families who resemble what today would be a private prison corporation?
Well, I think the readers need to come to their own conclusion what they think. I mean, if, the people that are listening to this paper, I have, like I said, I believe it was for profit.
You believe it's for their personal
But that doesn't mean that other people that read it are going to come to the same conclusion. I found it appalling. I found it appalling that she was basically prostituting these children out. I have a very
That's
hard...
the ticket to leave program.
Absolutely.
Can you talk a bit more about that?
Well,
Because that, I think, is a very interesting example of what you're talking about.
Okay, so they're teaching them to be domestic servants.
Right.
I mean, I think that's very apparent. And Smith is leasing them out to her affluent friends in the neighboring community.
And who receives the pay for that? Smith or the prison as an institution? Or that's the paper trail?
That's up for debate. That's up for debate.
And who does she lease them? Do we know? I mean, do you have
her affluent friends in the community.
But I mean, do you have their names? Are we able to see where they live?
Well, we know General Strait,
right,
for sure.
Right. Yeah. But you don't have a full roster of the leasees. That would be an interesting way of linking all these things together.
Absolutely.
Right? Okay.
Absolutely.
We have a couple that testified against her in the 1881 investigation.
A couple that had leased one of these.
Yeah, that had leased one and testified that the girl was sassing, so she sent her to Sarah.
Who then beat her.
Who then beat her and sent her back.
Her name was Jeannie Solomon.
Yeah.
Now, see, I mean, the more that one can trace these individuals, the better. And one more question for you, Kim. Again, something that struck me as I was listening that I thought was really interesting was realizing, as you say, so many of the people confined were girls who were not criminally convicted, but there also were women who were criminally convicted. Is there any way to get a sense of the interaction and relationship of the girls and the women inside the prison, or were they really kept separate? Do you have a sense of that, or?
I have a theory. Sarah Smith was orphaned at a young age,
right,
and was put in a home for friendless women, or a home for friendless children, and an orphanage, a Quaker orphanage
in England. Yes.
And went to live with friends, which would be like a foster home.
Friends as in friends, family, or friends as in Quaker?
Friends as in Quaker friends. Okay. So fast forward, she comes to America, lives her life, comes back from doing her good deeds during the Civil War, and she's hanging out with Elizabeth Comstock, who's a Quaker prison reformer. She hooks up with Charles and Rhoda, prison reformers, and I believe from reading different things that she wanted a girls' institution all along. Charles got an institution for the boys. She wanted an institution for the girls. She did not get that. The investigation in Jeffersonville takes place, and that's a prime opportunity for her to get her girls. And when you read the annual reports, Johnson, I keep calling her Elmira, and it's Elmina Johnson, was actually the superintendent of the women's prison. Although she's listed in the annual report as the assistant superintendent, she actually mainly deals with the penal side, and Smith deals with the reformatory.
With the girls. But it's one institution.
It's one institution. Now, Smith complains all the time that she does not want the penal institution women interfering and corrupting.
Because they'll be a bad influence.
Right, corrupting her girls. And she's vying to get her own reformatory up until the day that she leaves. She wants her own reformatory. She wants the girls taken out of the larger picture, which of course she never gets.
All right, Michelle, let me turn to you. So I think both you and Kim say or imply that one should consider these female benevolent reformers, who you're both very critical of, but one should consider them feminists, right? Why? Maybe, I know you use that term, Kim, and I think you do too, Michelle.
Actually, in terms of social feminists, I wouldn't say that they were particularly, because they were very focused on recreating the family, the household structure where the husband was in charge. They were very specific about reifying a sex and gender system that privileged men over women. They both of them were. Rhoda, in her couple of her testimonies, speeches, definitely said that while men could not reform women, they just could not. The family was most important, meaning the man at the head of the household, reinforcing those same social norms. So I personally wouldn't call them feminists in that sense. I know Rafter does and calls them social feminists, but I wouldn't particularly give them that title.
And why did they, given, and this sort of is historicizing this a bit, given all of the potential causes that these women benevolent reformers could focus their attention on in the 1870s, why did they look at the prison or an institution like that? I mean, they could generate their, I mean, as one of you suggests, they're down educating the freed people, they're doing other temperance work, right? Why do they zero in on the prison in this period?
It is my opinion that they focused in on the prison movement because the Quaker influence on prisons was well known, and they had been visiting prisons all across the country and the world, and Europe and London in particular. So it seemed to me, right after the Civil War, as their natural next mode of influence. And because they saw the atrocities in New York and other states, Tennessee, where women were confined with men.
And in Jeffersonville.
In Jeffersonville.
Right, yeah.
Where they were confined with men, and some of the things that happened to them, illegitimate births and rapes and all kinds of things. It became something in their ministerial work of visiting these prisons to minister the gospel that became a natural outgrowth to me.
So in contrast to Kim, you see at least their initial motives as benevolent.
Yeah, I do, because they talked a lot about the condition of the women and how horrid it was, and how they felt the women themselves had become debased as a result of being in these environments, in addition to their criminal, deviant nature, which they assigned to certain classes of women, right? So we know that they're assigning these ideas that these women weren't the same kind of woman as them, but they're also saying that they do need protection anyway.
But they don't bargain with the heterotopic nature of a total institution, which makes their ideals impossible.
I think that some of those aspects surprised them.
And why, and this is a question for both you and Anna, I think, why did the punishment regime and the control regime inside the prison itself focus so heavily on self-abuse, on masturbation? Like, why did that become such a critical concern for them? I mean, certainly cussing and sassing and all that, but they do seem to really focus on women's bodies with that as the thing that needs to be controlled and punished.
Well, and Anna can elaborate, but right around this time you have the medicalization of women's bodies going on, and Foucault in History of Sexuality talks about this whole process of policing young boys who were masturbating, and that the next stage of that was to policing young girls as they began to deal with women's bodies and enter into dealing with women's sexuality. That masturbation was the next thing, and because any sex that is outside of the institution of marriage, by Christian definition, is sin and evil, and so there's that religious ideology that's playing over all of this. So you touching your body is not permissible according to Christian standards, Christian beliefs, and so these women were enacting sin, and they had to be dealt with.
Anna,
women and girls.
Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think it goes a step deeper than that too, and that it is a reclamation of the body. So it is a way of saying, particularly in a situation like this, where you have lost legal personhood, but you have also lost your corporeal rights. It is a way of saying, this body, this flesh is still mine, and I will touch this flesh if I want to because it's mine and it belongs to me.
Right.
So self-abuse, masturbation on some level also becomes a form of resistance.
Yes.
And so you have to contain that, because if a woman seems to think that she has right or control over the body that you have just told her by nature of her conviction and her commitment that she no longer has that right, you have got to break that down.
Right.
You've got to stop her belief that her body is her own. And so self-abuse and this direct attack on masturbation was just absolutely crucial to ensuring that you had control over the entire body, the entire woman, and to let her really know where her place is. And I think, like Michelle is saying, you know, Smith and Kauffman state over and over again in the annual reports and in their writing that they were proving rehabilitation through making a woman of equality, quote unquote, good enough for marriage.
Right.
Okay.
Which again puts your body no longer within your own control, but in the control of someone else, in this context, in the control of a man, the head of the household.
Right.
And hence the ticket
So-
to
Right.
learn to be a domestic
right.
servant and
Yes.
serve
So you
in the
couldn't
household.
you
Right.
couldn't represent the facility or represent yourself even masturbating. You had to be placed, these constraints had to be placed upon you. So that's why, in my opinion, that's why certain degree of violence was integral to making the institution work. Because you have people who have ideologies and beliefs that are not your own. And if you're going to be an institution of power that imposes a certain set of rules, in order to do that, you need violence. So my point is that from the very beginning of the origins of these institutions, violence and sexual and gendered are key, fundamental components in making prisons work.
And
For
because,
them.
Right, because if,
Yeah.
For the reformer.
For the
Yes.
reformers, yes,
if
absolutely.
these women and girls find any sense of empowerment within their own body, in this case, in the sense of masturbation, that almost then becomes foundational to, well, if I can reclaim my body like this, how else can I reclaim my body? How else can I reclaim my life?
Refusing to work.
What else
Right.
can I
Right.
do to resist? If the
Or-
body is mine and I have the right to do what I want to do with the body because the body belongs to me, then I have asserted that it no longer belongs to you. And if it no
Right.
longer belongs to you, well, then maybe I can do more than just this with
So
it.
here's a final two questions for all three of you, really. So a lot of what you've been talking about and a lot of what we talked about right before we turned on the camera was the creation of what several of you have called a convict race, right? And this is occurring 10 years after emancipation, right at the moment Reconstruction is being overthrown, right at the moment when, you know, white supremacy is going to be reasserted. So how do you see kind of, you know, talk a bit about this notion of a convict race that I think all three of you point to.
Go ahead, Michelle.
Well, what we were talking about when we got started about this is that we were talking about the particular, Anna was talking about the continuum between now and the past, and how certain things have continued in order to create mass incarceration, and how these origins like violence and control of women's bodies and sexual and gendered violence have worked their way through a continuum of time to create this situation in which we're in mass incarceration in the United States. And so what my point was, and which we were talking about, is I just lost her name. Oh, I was talking about Vanessa Weaver's piece and front lash.
Right,
Yes. And how front lash was one of those key components that was trying to reinstitute that total control, that total social control, and as also a retribution from the civil rights movement and feminist women's movement, and how many of the things in which we have seen in the late 19th century with the creations of these prisons are still happening today. We are showing that sexual victimization by staff, sexual victimization inmate on inmate is still a part of prisons. Gendered violence is still a part of prisons. And what we were talking about is that all the different things that make that happen. One of the things is front lash and the birth of the mass incarceration and the prison industrial complex. And Anna had some things and Kim has some things, but they all reach back to these early origins of institutions, and they show a development of a continuum in time. I don't know, you want to...
And Anna, I think you were talking about sort of the proliferation of these prison reality shows, Lockdown, and
Yeah.
Women in Prison, as a way of sort of acclimating the population to dehumanization.
Yeah, well, I think this goes all along the continuum from the beginning. You have to create a mindset of separatism and exclusionary thinking, and you have to create this mindset of inferiority with certain people. And so I think if we're talking about it in context of front lash, and this being a direct attack against civil rights and feminist movement, okay, so if people of color and women are starting to gain different levels of equality, how do you then tear that equality down? Well, you have to assert inferiority. And so the convict race, the convict label, the deviant label, then provides a space to do that. So you may have gained rights because of your skin color or because of your sex, but now we have reconfigured and recreated a way to keep you inferior and to keep you as a lesser status. So if you can inflict that thinking, and I think the best way to do that, and which we're currently seeing, and that's what we were talking about, is through mass media and social media, to create this mindset that the criminal, the convict, is someone other. And in that otherness, you are inferior, you are deviant, you are someone to be feared, to be loathed, to be beneath other people. That's the very foundation of how these things not only were created and continue, but have hit such a mass and epic proportion now. So it's instilling this mind frame of a whole separate class of people that you are justified to treat, do, and use as you will because they are less than.
Yeah, and one of the reasons why it's kind of come up on the spectrum is because mass incarceration is brought on the spectrum. 65 million people in the United States have criminal records. You can no longer have conversations about economics and politics and education without the idea of the incarcerated person having to be brought into that conversation, because there's just so many people walking around with the criminal taint.
Right.
So it can't hide anymore. You know,
So that secrecy that's so essential
the secrecy, so it could,
gone.
you know, is that Foucault heterotopia is out now, and people are finding ways to market, you know, and make money off of it. As you know, Kim
as the
alluded
Kauffmans
to,
did, right?
as the Kauffmans did, and people are.
Okay, so I want to talk a little
Yeah, so
bit
Kim, why
about
don't you-
children.
yes.
Okay,
Okay.
so we all know, and I can't quote the percentages off the top of my head, but if you have one, and this is, you know, statistical information that's out there, it's common knowledge. If you have one parent incarcerated, the likelihood of your children becoming incarcerated is very high.
Yes.
If you have two children or two
75%.
parents incarcerated, you know, it's almost a
It's almost
guarantee
Yeah.
that your kid's going to wind up in an institution someplace, some way, somehow. So I'm not trying to downgrade that, because there are issues involved in children being separated from their parents, which causes trauma, yada, yada, yada. However, I would just like to say that I do not believe, just as happened in, you know, 19th century, that separating children from their parents is the answer. And incarcerating children is not the answer. And, you know, to talk about what happened in the 19th century, there was this mindset that goes along with what we've been talking about in deviance and labeling people deviant. And the taint of the woman transferred onto her children. You know, so if the woman was deemed deviant or not of the standard of Smith and Kauffman, then her children were deviant. You know, and
Butler
this is
had a
where-
solution to
I was
that.
saying it's
Right.
that automatic trickle
so
down.
it's so, you know, and so, but nothing's changed. I'm sorry, nothing's changed.
Right.
You know, and we need, I believe, as I, you know, the Zinn quote that I had, Howard Zinn, God rest his soul. I loved him and I loved his work. And, you know, now, thanks to us and other people like us, there's another side, there's another story being told. And I don't necessarily think that happened. I'm trying to use these women's names as much as possible in my work. So much for Sarah Smith and Rhoda Kauffman. You know, what about Jeannie Solomon and Belle Ward and the women who don't have names? That need names. They need voices. Their stories need to be told, just like our stories need to be told.
Right.
Thank you. A great way to end. Kim.
Yes.
I hope other AHA members have some questions that they can also then forward on when they watch this panel. And I hope you've all enjoyed this really illuminating discussion with Anastazia Schmid, Kim Baldwin, and Michelle Jones. Thanks. And
Thank
thanks to Kelsey Kauffman for putting this together.
Absolutely.
Yes. Thank you. I'm going to hit that.